Hello everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to introduce our new risk indicator for Quant Network and its native token QNT. If you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter where we put out regular updates about our risk indicators and more. So if you're returning to the channel, you're quite familiar with our upside downside potential indicator, UDPI. So this is a risk indicator, so scores that are high, so 5 is high risk. That's when the upside potential is quite low, downside potential is quite high. -5 is low risk. That's when the downside potential is quite low, upside potential is quite high. So you can see is that throughout QNT's price history, that's what I'm showing you here, color-coded based on the UDPI, it does a good job of identifying these relatively high-risk zones, these low-risk zones, and these kind of tops that, in this case for QNT, precipitated this pretty massive correction that we've seen off of the all-time high. Now, one of the things I think is really interesting about QNT's price action is that you'll notice is that it didn't really take a hit during the summer of 21 like most other altcoins did, right? You know, it's pretty much just flat through that entire time before shooting off to the upside kind of in that rally that followed off of the summer. I think that's quite notable because most other assets have been quite hard hit from that. So even though it kind of got to an elevated risk level here, all it had to do is just kind of consolidate sideways to start cooling off before it was able to move back up, which I think is quite interesting. It's quite notable that it was able to hold up so well during that time. But of course, after this run, now it's shown that it has needed to correct off of that to get back into these lower risk levels. And you probably have noticed that we are down in the green zone again, which I think is notable. So I'm showing you here the long-term UDPI. This is the raw output of the model, so just UDPI plot on the y-axis here. So the long-term version of the UDPI cares about moves that play out over months to years. So these longer, more macro kind of type moves. We have other time frames that we also have UDPIs for. I'll show you in a minute. But I think one of the things that's interesting about QNT across time is just looking at how much it interacts with this kind of -3 zone, right? So kind of this, you know, dipped a little bit below it here, but then kind of held it as support here, come back, hold support here, interact with it here, and then more recently, maybe potentially finding a bottom here as well, which might suggest that kind of QNT will realize downside potential until it gets to around that level. But oftentimes it finds that as a bottom. It really only broke down once below it in its history. So I just think it is interesting that we found this as a bottom here again. Now, of course, we are moving back down. We'll have to see if we can start realizing some of this upside potential in the coming months, or if we have to realize more of this downside potential. So one of the things that's important to note about an asset like QNT being an altcoin is that it's really dependent on what Bitcoin is doing. Bitcoin is doing well, then altcoins tend to do well, and I would expect QNT to be just do the same. So those are the conditions where I expect QNT to start shooting up and realizing this upside potential, is if Bitcoin starts looking really bullish, or if the broader macro conditions around equities and things like that improve, look more bullish, then I think this upside potential very much comes in play. As it stands right now, where things are a lot more uncertain, you know, I'm not expecting QNT to just immediately go realizing this upside potential. You know, I think consolidation is very plausible, or potentially even having to go down and realize some more downside before being able to move back up. It's just kind of the unfortunate reality of crypto that when the broader market's bearish, it's very difficult for any altcoin to be the one that goes against the grain and rallies. It certainly can happen, but it's very difficult. So that's why my base case is not to expect QNT to go parabolic while the rest of the market is pretty bearish. If Bitcoin does start looking healthier or start looking really bullish, or especially if the broader macro condition starts kind of getting relief from this overall bearish sentiment that's existed, then it might be more plausible for that to happen. So let's look now at the other versions of the UDPI. So the medium term of the cares about moves that play out over weeks to months, so a bit shorter time preference than the long term. And the short term is kind of days to weeks, so even shorter preference. And you'll just see that the short term UDPI cares a lot more about this kind of intermediate volatility here than the long term. The long term doesn't really care about this kind of shorter term volatility. It cares about moves that play out over longer periods. Shorter term is trying to capture moves that play out over shorter times, and the medium term is kind of in the middle. And we can see is that you know, QNT had rallied off of the local bottom in January, which is what's getting captured here by realizing its shorter term upside potential. Now it's starting to cool off again, and it's kind of right in that undecided period. Whereas on the long term and the medium term, overall it's a little bit more bullish in its bias. I think there's more realistic upside than downside potential coming weeks to months, and the coming months to years over here. And we can see the exact levels if I just flip over to this view here, where the long-term version of the UDPI is at negative 2.75, medium-term negative 1.7, short-term 0.19. And so really what way that I interpret this is that in the long term, UDPI is bullish on QNT. I think there's more realistic upside than downside potential. But again, that doesn't have to happen immediately, especially if Bitcoin stays unhealthy. If Bitcoin keeps on correcting, not doing well, we might have to realize more of this downside potential before we can start moving back up. But then, and that's also partly being reflected in the shorter term, where it's kind of undecided that in the short term, nothing's telling me that we have to just go to the upside, that's the way we have to go. In fact, it sees that the upside and the downside being equally plausible in the shorter term, which I think is notable. And the medium term is kind of in the middle, as you might expect. So kind of my overall takeaway is that, especially if the broader market is going to get more bullish, I would see no reason not to be bullish on QNT, especially given this reading right here. But in the shorter term, I think caution is definitely warranted. Not financial advice, just my take. Alright, if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter. And remember, with the UDPI, we're all going to make it.